Let me give a little bit of note on depth. I talked about sort of like these deeper worldviews. One of the things that I think is really valuable, one of the things that's oftentimes missed, is that I think depth in storytelling is something that can be felt, right? When something is deeply layered, when there are layers to a world or to characters or to a story, it comes through and you feel it. Tolkien is a great example of this. I think Tolkien is well enough known at this point that we all know that he was a linguist. We all know that he spent years and years and years and years and years of his life building out this lore. We know that, even though you have the Fellowship of the Rings and the Two Towers, and you have the Hobbit, right? You have the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and you have the Hobbit, that he had sort of like all of this lore built around like the entire history of Middle Earth, that all the places that appear in Middle Earth that we hear about in the Lord of the Rings series have their own histories that Tolkien actually like worked out, that the languages being used are actually worked out by Tolkien, and all the rest. Okay. You feel that, right? That comes through. Tolkien is not, when he introduces you to, the writers of Rohan, they're not just a cardboard, well, I just need like some soldiers who ride horses. We'll just say that they're horsemen and they live over in this area. And, and basically everything that Tolkien thinks about Rohan can be written, in a single paragraph. And that's everything that he's working off of. That gets you a very two-dimensional sort of people group there in this sort of story. You don't get that, right? Tolkien is just sort of layered and layered and layered, where you're like, man, there's a whole history here. There's whole languages here. There's whole cultures here. There's myths here. People are referencing stuff that I don't know what they're referencing, but I gather that it's related to all this other stuff that's sitting in the background. You feel that depth, right? That comes through. And I think, with somebody like C.S. Lewis, and let's take something that has less depth, which is like the Narnia Chronicles. Now, I know that people might be upset because it's like, well, come on, it's C.S. Lewis. He's great. Lewis is great. Anybody who's listened to me knows that I think, Lewis is really great. But no one could possibly suggest, not even Lewis himself would suggest, that the world of the Narnia Chronicles was as deeply fleshed out and nuanced and layered as Tolkien's world. Now, the fact of the matter is, you might be of the mind where you go like, but wait a second, when I read Narnia, I still get rich, nuance, depth, and insight, and so on. I agree, you do. But the nuance and the depth is not actually related to the world. It's not because, Lewis went through like the multiple ages, of Narnia and has like this fully fleshed out history the way Tolkien does. The nuance and depth that you encounter in Narnia is Lewis's own worldview. So this is something that I think a lot of people don't realize about Lewis. I think they feel it, they recognize it, but they don't like recognize it, which is that a lot of what makes Lewis's writing, his storytelling interesting whenever he tells a story is his narration. If you strip away the narration and you just see like this person did this thing and this person did this thing and that person said that thing, a lot of the depth just disappears, because so often Lewis as a storyteller is sitting there talking to you about what's going on in the person's head. They feel this thing and their mind begins to race, and that becomes like him going off into a whole aside about philosophy and theology. I think, for example, in Paralandra, which is part of Lewis's Space Trilogy. If you haven't read it, read it. It's fantastic. But there's a point where you have like the Green Lady, who's basically kind of like an Eve character, although Lewis wants to say that she's not exactly Eve, but read the book. So you have this sort of Eve character, and then you have a demonic character who shows up and tempts her. And then you have this third character who's an observer, who comes from Earth, who actually is observing this and recognizes the uncanny parallel with Eden and feels the weight of that. Well, there's this moment where he's like these moments where he's navigating, as part of this trio, right? This woman and this demonic figure in himself. He's trying to keep her from falling into sin and things like that. The actual events of what the characters do in that, sequence is actually relatively limited, but it's very engaging and it's very interesting and it's very deep and it's very nuanced. But all the nuance is Lewis talking through what the character, Ransom is his name, the character from Earth, all of the stuff that he's dealing with running through thinking about like predestination and free will and fate and the unfairness of this situation and, the weight of this entire cosmos resting on his shoulders and trying to prevent her from sin, all this sort of stuff. That's where so much of Lewis's depth comes in. When he talks about in the Narnia books, when Aslan begins to sing the world into being. This happens in the Magician's Nephew. You end up, I think that's where it is. Yep. Where what happens, Aslan begins to sing the world into being. There's this whole fascinating aside where Lewis is going into describing what's happening. Now, what's interesting about what he's describing, he's actually describing his sort of like Christian Neoplatonism, because he's talking about the way in which Aslan is singing and things are coming into being. And it's almost as if there's certain archetypal ideas that are in his head. And, it's almost as if as he thinks of things and then sings them, that they were manifesting outside of. Lewis is here describing for kids like Christian Neoplatonism. I hate to call it that, but see my lectures on go see The Most Important Question and other things like My Case for Realism and things like that, where I talk about realism. But I'll use for shorthand Lewis's Christian Neoplatonism. Anyway, the point is to say that so much of what is deep and rich about Lewis is not actually the story or the world of the story. It's the overlay of his commentary and his narration, where he's introducing through story people to all sorts of nuances about theology and philosophy and things like that. Now, now and then you do have certain stories like The Great Divorce, where because so much of it happens in dialogues, you end up getting a lot of theology out of the mouths of the characters. But most of the time, the depth and nuance of what Lewis is doing is in the sort of meta layer of the commentary about the worldview, about the happenings, about the theology and things like that. So my point in that is to say that, like, yes, Lewis is deep and rich and layered, but the depth is all in that overlay of his narration. Whereas Tolkien, it's the world itself that is layer upon layer upon layer that seems to go on endlessly. Now, the reason I bring that up is because I think you can feel that, right? You can feel the difference between, say, somebody telling a story about talking animals and C.S. Lewis. Why? Because they're telling a story about talking animals, and there's not the level of philosophical and theological depth that you have with Lewis when Lewis is telling the story, and he's sort of telling on top of this all of this nuanced philosophy and theology. With Tolkien, right? We all encounter fantasy, but not all fantasy feels as deep and rich as Tolkien's world. Why? Well, because a lot of those worlds are not as deep and rich as Tolkien's world.
Hey, quick pause here. I'm going to be teaching an accredited college-level course that will begin in the coming months. But before I lock in the details, I want your input. You can take it for 3 credit hours with roughly 30 hours of lecture, homework, a grade, the whole shebang, including a transcript to send to the college of your choice, or you can audit the class, if you'd rather just sit in on the lectures with yours truly and do no homework. The class will be designed to work for anyone who can hang with an undergrad college course, be they advanced high school students, retirees, or anyone in between. So take a minute and fill out the poll. You'll find the link in the description below.
Now, one of the questions that I think is an interesting question is just a general sort of media question, which is to say, is this just sort of an inevitable limitation of certain storytelling mediums? I will say, I do think there's a very real challenge in adapting C.S. Lewis to screen, to film, because where I see his greatest depth, where I think he really thrives, is in that surface layer. And so many of the stories he tells, I'm sorry, not the surface layer, the sort of meta layer, the narration layer. Because I think when you're translating that into a film, you have to remove that layer and just deal with the actions and the words of the characters. That creates a natural challenge for retaining the depth of Lewis when telling the story, because all you're left with is the characters in the world and the events. So you would have to engage in something like creating a narrator who's reflecting back on this in order to bring that layer back in. Or you'd have to do a movie like The Great Divorce or something like that, where you actually do already have it woven more into the fabric of the story. But I think Lewis is really sort of difficult to adapt for that reason. With Tolkien, I think it's very difficult to get that if not impossible. I mean, to get that level of depth that Tolkien has, I mean, that is an exceedingly rare level of depth in storytelling, sort of the extent to which Tolkien built his world. But here's what I would give, where I would give high praise to somebody like Peter Jackson. If you've ever watched the behind the scenes, like the making of the original Lord of the Rings, it's fantastic. I got the way back when I got the like multi-disc behind the scenes extended editions, whatever. And I watched all of that behind the scenes stuff, the hours and hours and hours of it. And one of the things that I really loved about that was that I saw something that is very, very rare in Hollywood. In Hollywood, for all of the money that gets spent on a movie, it's still really tight budgets, right? It's very expensive to get high-end cinematographers. It's very expensive to get CGI. Like these things are very expensive. And so even though you might look at the price tag on a certain movie and say, well, they could have done more or whatever, well, oftentimes there's not a ton of waste within Hollywood budgets. Like they do tend to be reflective of industry standards in terms of cost for certain services and things like that. But what you saw with the Lord of the Rings series that Peter Jackson did is you saw something that was very, very rare. New Line Cinema actually did go ahead and give Jackson the latitude to build out that world in a long-term, multi-layered way that films are rarely given. So Jackson, the prep work for making the Lord of the Rings, the original series, was they had years, right? So just to take an example, Hobbiton, right? They actually built Hobbiton, we know this, but then they built it at a time that was so far out from filming that they wanted it to be overgrown. They wanted to tend to the gardens. They wanted to make it genuinely look and feel lived in, which took years. Most films can't do that. If you build a set, you build a set. You build as much as a set as you can, then you green screen the rest and fill in the rest. And, you do the best you can with different, paint and whatever else to try to make it look aged, but it's not really going to be aged because you don't have time to age it. But Jackson, they gave that time to. Similarly with like costuming. It was fascinating listening to the costume designer who like made Aragorn's outfit. And she's talking about, I was thinking through all this stuff about, well, he's going to need carrying pouches for this or for that. And she went ahead and she actually was given the time and the latitude and the budget to go ahead and do those sorts of intense nuances. So when she went through Aragorn's outfit, she was talking about like hidden pouches and things like that she put in there where you might keep this or you might keep that and so on. That's never going to show up on screen. And yet somehow what you see is like that depth and nuance comes through. They pulled in to work with the production design department, these illustrators, right? This pair of illustrators who had dedicated their lives to illustrating Tolkien. So they knew Tolkien backwards. They had spent their whole lives trying to figure out how do you visualize and portray and things like that. And Jackson recognized that. So he's like, okay, you guys have spent so much time in the source material. You're part of the culture that preserves it. Let's bring you in and let's talk with you about, why you portrayed it this way and all this sort of stuff. And they worked with the production design department. And with that, what you start to get is you get that each culture, they're thinking through things like, okay, Tolkien really thought through how, the dwarves, what their language is like. And then with that, because it's very angular, their architecture should be very much that way. Their weapons should be very much that way. And so it was highly thought through, where there was a genuine world and a culture that was sort of dug into here. My point in all of this is that even though no filmmaker could possibly give the depth to a world or to a story that Tolkien did, what you saw with Peter Jackson is you felt that depth. You felt that depth that comes through in a different way than when Hollywood is just sort of racing ahead and trying to, do CGI or, quick build out sets and make them look age. When you do the level of prep work and care and worldview digging that Jackson did, that comes through. And so I think that the fact of the matter is that you can get depth like that in film. It's just that Hollywood rarely gives the time and the expense necessary to do it. And if they did, I mean, Lord knows that the budget on Rings of Power should have allowed for that amount of depth. But it also matters who's in charge, right? And so somebody like Jackson very clearly did not want to engage in Hollywood taxidermy. He respected Tolkien. He considered it an honor to be entrusted with Tolkien. You can disagree with how he interprets certain characters. I know a lot of these arguments that they dislike how the decisions that Jackson made, and they think it's contrary to Tolkien and so on. Fair, you can make those arguments. But I don't think anybody, even the critics of Jackson, would suggest that Jackson didn't revere the source material and wasn't trying to be true to this. He clearly was, right? He clearly, and was very vocal about the fact that he shouldn't be in here telling what he wants to tell. He's telling Tolkien's story. He's not building his own world. He's building, Tolkien's world. And so he was deeply concerned with bringing in scholars who were going to, help him be true to the source material, bringing in those artists who had devoted their entire lives to being, visualizing Tolkien, as well as bringing in people like folks who are aware of like armor and swords and trying to make it as authentic as possible and really build a world that is authentic. And I think that's a rare thing. It's a rare thing in Hollywood, unfortunately, but it's one of those things that, that as rare as it is, it's one of the things that makes that so excellent. And it really is exemplary in terms of how do you go ahead and honor source material, deep, rich source material. And I think that is a good example of how you go ahead and do that. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.